Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts and in the US. And I see people are here from all over the world, as we expect, because Toni is in the UK. We are in the US, and we are expecting to have like a fabulous talk on how to survive in Tudor England today with Toni. This is her second time with us. So I'm very, very happy to welcome her back. But before we get started, just a couple things. I want to say thanks to the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs and to Toni for letting us share this program with other libraries, because when libraries, work together, we make magic. And so we welcome all the patrons of Ashland and to those partnering libraries, as well as Toni's fans from around the globe, apparently. She's going to be talking for about 50 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I will be turning the chat off during her slides. But you can still chat with me if you're having any tech issues or anything. And I'll turn it back on when she's finished, so you can be chatter with each other, which is always fun. You can buy signed books by Toni from Aesop's Fable, our favorite local indie bookstore. And if you live in the UK or thereabouts, I will send information on how to contact Toni directly, so you don't have to pay as much shipping, and she can tell you where to buy them for you locally. So without further ado, I want to say Toni is a historian, a teacher. She does these classes. She has written several books, and they're all fascinating. How to survive. We had her last time for how to survive in medieval England. This is Tudor England, and she's going to be back with us next May for Anglo-Saxon England. So Toni, welcome back. Thanks so much for being with us again.
Well, thank you, Mina, for inviting me. And hello, America. Good morning to you. It's middle of the afternoon here. So today I'm going to be talking to you about Tudor England from the point of view that if you were able to travel back to the 16th century, how would you keep safe? How would you get on with the local people? How would you survive the perilous lack of hygiene? And how might you keep safe when kings and queens change the religion only to change it back again? Well, my book on how to survive in Tudor England explains the history and, most importantly, advises you as a visitor on how you can keep your head. So let's begin. In 1485, after Henry Tudor was victorious at the Battle of Bosworth, defeating King Richard III, Henry proclaimed himself king. He then took the unprecedented step of dating his reign as having begun the day before the battle. Now, it might not sound like much to add an extra day to your time on the throne, but it was in fact very risky. And Henry's counsellors strenuously advised him not to do it. But Henry was determined. By insisting he was already King of England before the battle even began, Richard III and his loyal supporters could be accused of treason on a technicality, having taken up arms against the true and rightful King, Henry. Now, of course, it was all a fiction, but Henry forced his first parliament to confirm this in a legal act, making any survivors on Richard's side vulnerable. Henry could put them under attainder, which meant that lands, property, and titles were confiscated, and their heirs couldn't inherit anything. If he wished, the new king could have them tried and executed for treason. His advisors pointed out that any future invader intent on taking Henry's crown, should he succeed, might well do the same to Tudor supporters, and that this possibility could deter Henry's subjects from standing by him in battle. But Henry chose to ignore the warning, and he certainly had his reasons. The royal coffers were empty. King Richard's need to raise an army to face the Tudor and his insistence on repaying any debts owed by the crown had already emptied the royal treasury. So rather than executing too many of Richard's loyal men, Henry decided to pardon most of them for a fee, a huge fee, and even to give them back at least some of their properties in return for the payment of gigantic fines. And all this money went into Henry's piggy bank. Any unreturned titles and lands could now be bestowed as rewards to Henry's supporters or sold to help further refill the coffers. Henry Tudor's interest in money was such that he is the only English monarch ever to bequeath a fortune to his successor. So that is the situation in 1485. Now, moving on a few years, 16th century England is a very tricky place, what with the Reformation of the Church, royal marriages, religious persecution, and later on, Elizabethan intrigue. As with so many societies across the world, even in our own times, in Tudor England, there was a wide chasm dividing the rich and the poor. Now, this had been true in medieval times. No one could mistake the gap between an earl and the serfs who worked his land. But at least there was employment for everyone and food and shelter available for all. Unfortunately, the situation changed during the Tudor era, and the first problem was something called enclosures. Now, enclosures refer to the fencing off or hedging of large fields to enclose huge numbers of sheep and keep them from wandering off. Well-to-do yeomen, that is the better off farmers of the day, would buy up the smaller holdings of their poorer neighbours and turn the land into one big sheep farm. Now, sheep can be cared for by just a couple of shepherds with a bit of extra help at lambing and shearing time. So the wages bill for the yeoman was small, but the profits from selling the wool could be enormous. Landowners across England saw the benefits as country yeomen became wealthy gentlemen farmers, which was great news for them. But what about their poorer neighbours whose land now grew nothing but grass for the sheep? Now, unless the poorer neighbour was employed as a shepherd, he could end up jobless, unable to grow his own food, and without money to pay the rent or feed and clothe his family. So what could he do but go looking for work elsewhere? But there were thousands like him, and things got worse. With far less food being grown for human consumption, prices rose dramatically just for a loaf of bread or a single egg. And this was problem number 2 for the poor, inflation. But at least the poor could still drop by the local abbey or priory and claim dole. Dole was simply bread and ale, enough to keep them going until tomorrow. And religious houses occasionally gave out alms in the form of second-hand clothing or old blankets, which might save the homeless family from dying of cold. Religious houses also provided care for the sick and infirm, as well as schooling and education. Monasteries and nunneries were the welfare system of the day, which brings us to problem number 3 for the poor, the dissolution. In 1536, King Henry VIII decided to close all the religious houses in England. This is known as the dissolution of the monasteries and was his get-rich-quick recipe, as well as a metaphorical poke in the eye for the Pope in Rome, who had refused Henry a divorce. So all this was great news for Henry, but a disaster for the poor, the homeless, and the unemployed, who were increasing in number daily. Suddenly, there was no welfare to be had except for charitable individuals and the parish church. But these usually combined their donations to local people in trouble, not to those who'd walked miles in search of work. Inevitably, many of these unemployed and homeless people turned to begging in an attempt to feed their family. But it was all too easy to slip into a life of crime. The disabled and the elderly who could not work were seen as deserving Christian charity. So they were granted licenses to beg by the authorities. But so-called sturdy beggars and vagabonds who were quite capable of working for a living, if only they could find a job, were regarded as either too idle to do a hand's turn of work, or else they must be up to no good. And so no license to beg would be granted to them. And for those who had no skills to earn a living and no license, there was only one alternative to starvation: theft. And Henry VIII's answer to the problem of crime was to introduce even more stringent punishments: death for stealing the most trivial items. With the closure of the monasteries, priories, and friaries in the late 1530s, homeless monks, nuns, and their lay servants swelled the numbers of the unemployed, often with no skills or trade to earn their living any other way. Some of the better educated monks were taken on as tutors to the children of the wealthy. But at the other extreme, some poor nuns turned to prostitution to avoid starvation. Clearly, the majority of those without a job were honest folk with no intention of turning to crime to feed, clothe, and provide shelter for themselves and their families. So, what were the alternative means of support? Well, sadly, the answer was almost nothing. However, later in the Tudor period, somebody came up with a new idea, a way to deal with the poor, sending them somewhere else. In the 1580s, into the reign of Elizabeth I, Ireland needed fit, healthy workers to colonise her empty land. A man called George Peckham thought the great numbers which live in such penury and want could serve in Ireland for 1 year for meat, drink, and apparel only, without any wages, to amend their estates. So it doesn't seem to say what they're going to do when the year was up. An armchair geographer known as Richard Hakluyt had an even better idea. Let's ship them off to the new world across the Atlantic. And not only the poor and unemployed should take up this indentured or on-contract service. Hakluyt said, why not empty England's prisons and send all the inmates to America? So by 1619, which is actually into the Tudor period, this system was populating Virginia with poor folk, hoping to make a new life, but it certainly wasn't an easy option. Now, seafaring in the 16th century was quite literally changing the world. Gerard Mercator, a Flemish-born German working in the Netherlands, was famous for his vast knowledge of geography, his detailed atlases, globes, and navigational maps for mariners, all of them produced without ever once leaving home. This is a map he came up with. Instead, Mercator used his huge library of over 1,000 books and corresponded in 6 different languages with merchants, scholars, and seamen who travelled across the world. In 1541, he produced the first marvellous globe, showing the world as it was then known, with quite a degree of detail for the eastern coast of America. But the western coast remained vague, guesswork for the most part. If you look at this map, over to the left-hand side, you've got North America right up the top there. And then you've got the narrow bit of Central America. And then you've got quite a bit of the coast of Brazil and Argentina, but all the rest is vague. You've actually got the Caribbean islands all marked. So that was all they knew in that direction. If you look at Asia, you've got the shape of Africa, that's pretty obvious, but India hardly notices. But you've got a triangular islands there, which is actually Sri Lanka, which they seem to think was much bigger than it really was. And a lot of the world's spices came from there. And also from the Indonesian islands, which again are shown rather large. And over on the right-hand side there, if you can see the island that's shaped rather like a footprint, that's supposed to be Japan. So they knew all that pretty well, but the Americas are still a bit of a mystery. Now, perhaps the most significant contribution to this map could have been Sir Francis Drake's logbook and reports of his circumnavigation of the world in 1577 to 80. However, despite proving once and for all that the Earth was a sphere, for political reasons, Drake said very little about his voyage that was ever made public. Now, this was mainly because he'd been harassing Spanish territory in the New World. Everything in South America, Mexico, and North America technically belonged to Spain. The only exception was Brazil, which belonged to Portugal, which one they speak Portuguese there. So Drake had been harassing the Spanish and waylaying their treasure-laden galleons at sea. So the less said about that, the better. But Drake also explored the Pacific coast of America, perhaps as far north as Alaska. And the English had no intention of revealing their knowledge and discovery of these places to anybody else, especially not the Spaniards, who were the enemy at the time. Eventually, Drake circumnavigated the globe, and what an adventure that must have been. Later on into the 17th century, when the English begin serious colonization of the eastern seaboard of North America, they actually laid claim to the entire expanse of the continent, from sea to shining sea, as you put it. And this was done on the grounds that Drake had been the first to land in California, most likely in what became known as San Francisco Bay, on the 15th of June, 1579, naming the land Nova Albion, which means New England in Latin, and predating New England on the eastern seaboard of North America. He claimed what would become San Francisco in the name of Queen Elizabeth, and planted the English flag there, which is why the claim is from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In 1584 and 85, Sir Walter Raleigh, who you probably heard of, sponsored the first English colony in North America on Roanoke Island. It's now in North Carolina, but at the time, the whole area was just called Virginia, though the locals called it Wingandacoa. Raleigh's agents, he himself never ever set foot there, wanting to persuade would-be colonists, painted a rosy picture of the new country. The land smells sweetly, as if we be in the midst of some delicate garden. The soil is so fertile that a day's labour in planting will provide food for a year. But despite this wonderful advertising, this wasn't a venture for anyone expecting an easy existence and stupendous profits. In fact, the colony failed, and another attempt at colonisation also failed in 1587. And you may wonder why the English believed they had the right to colonise there at all. The land must belong to someone, happened to be Spain, according to the Treaty of Tordesillas. However, at the time, the Spaniards hadn't come this far north on the east coast of America, so they hadn't claimed the land. A clause in the treaty specifies that new lands were only up for grabs so long as they were uninhabited by any Christian prince. Now, although the English weren't even mentioned in the treaty, they, along with the Dutch, the French, and any other European nation wanting to expand their horizons, took that phrase to mean any territory occupied by heathen savages, that is, by people who were not Christian, in which case the land was available for exploitation and colonisation. And although that definition served for now, it wasn't long before the Christian princes, so-called, were fighting amongst themselves over all the desirable lands. One of the first English settlers to arrive in Virginia in 1585, attempt at colonisation, was John White, a London gentleman, map maker and artist, who painted these watercolour images of the local people. He also did pictures of wildlife and the landscape. Among the strange new crops and wonders of the Americas, Sir Walter Raleigh was credited with bringing potatoes and tobacco back to Britain, and his influence at court certainly made smoking very popular there. Although Queen Elizabeth first didn't take up that habit, a lot of her courtiers did, and tobacco was even believed to have health-giving properties. Right, bit of a change of topic now. Now, in Tudor England, being a member of the up-and-coming gentlemanly class would probably be the safest choice for you as a traveller. They're not scratching a living in poverty, but neither are they so rich and powerful that they attract the notice of an envious monarch. Tudor houses were becoming far more comfortable, with fancy chimneys, window glass, and wood panelling to keep out the drafts. And the shared living accommodation of medieval times had gone out of fashion, and the modern family liked to eat and sleep more privately. Richard Clement was a gentleman, probably born around 1482. He bought a medieval manor house in Kent known as Moat in 1521, paying £400. He'd served as a page of the Privy Chamber and then as a groom of the same to King Henry VII. But Henry VIII dismissed him when he became king in 1509. And this was perhaps Clement's first lucky break, avoiding the service of the new and volatile monarch. But he was appointed as what was called a gentleman usher, which sort of meant he worked from home, reporting any suspicious activities going on in his Kentish neighbourhood. Clement decided that Moat was a bit too old-fashioned and began an expensive rebuilding scheme on his new home. He added the gatehouse tower, which you can see in the picture, to impress his visitors as they arrived. Large stained glass windows were put into the original medieval Great Hall, making it much brighter. And these windows included Clement's coat of arms, along with those of King Henry VIII and the pomegranate badge of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, all displayed in the coloured glass. Clement also built a magnificent new guest suite and the latest in fine living, a long gallery, so guests could take indoor walks in wet weather. So you have to wonder if he was hoping for a royal visit. Now, in 1529, Clement received a knighthood for helping his neighbour, the Archbishop of Canterbury, when a host of belligerent Kentish men attacked the Archbishop's palace at nearby Knoll. So now he's Sir Richard Clement, and he had other important neighbours not far away at Hever Castle. Thomas Boleyn, the Earl of Wiltshire. Now, Boleyn was Clement's patron, and Sir Richard received an invitation to the event of the year in 1533, when Boleyn's daughter Anne was crowned queen as Henry VIII's second wife in Westminster Abbey. But Sir Richard's second lucky break is that he wasn't too closely associated with Anne and managed to keep his head, unlike others of Anne's friends. In fact, Sir Richard Clement died in his comfortable bedchamber at Moat in 1538, aged 56, and was buried in the village church with a fine brass monument to mark his last resting place. Clement knew how to survive in dangerous Tudor times, and 56 was a reasonably good age. So, moving on. Now, of course, if you're travelling back, you'll want to know what food you can eat and how to stay healthy. And the two were intertwined according to the ideas of Tudor medicine and with a holistic approach to well-being as we would understand it today. However, what was considered a healthy diet will probably surprise you. Andrew Boord, physician to Henry VIII, wrote in detail in his book, The Dietary of Health, in 1542, about the food he recommended to keep fit and healthy. He said, eating too much shortens your life, and 2 meals a day should be enough, unless you're doing hard manual labour, in which case 3 meals may be allowed. The physician was particularly concerned for the eating and drinking habits of English men and women probably. But remember, it's definitely a man's world in Tudor England. He writes, a lord's dish, good for an Englishman, for it makes him strong and hardy. Beef, so be it a beast, the beast be young, and it must not be cow flesh, nor over salted. Veal is good and easily digested, and boar's meat, pork in other words, is a usual dish in winter for an Englishman. Now, the idea that men shouldn't eat cow meat was because the flesh of a female animal was believed to be contrary to a male body. Dr. Boord also says that bread should be made from wheat alone, not mixed grains, but oat cakes are a lordly dish as well. He writes that pottage is eaten more in England than anywhere else in Christendom, and it's made by adding oatmeal, herbs and seasoning into boiling meat stock, so it makes sort of porridge consistency. Or, he says, an Englishman might enjoy a nourishing, strength-building frumenty by stewing meat and wheat in milk. But otherwise, milk is only good for old men, melancholy people, children, and consumptives. So milk was not thought to be good for grown men, and neither was butter. You're allowed butter for breakfast, but not for the rest of the day. Now, Boord also says that all meats and drinks, the which be sweet and that sugar is in, be nutritious. And Queen Elizabeth I's blackened teeth were nothing to be ashamed of. They were simply a declaration of her wealth and position. Dr. Boord goes on, as for carters and ploughmen, bacon is good for them, and bacon and eggs are very wholesome for such folk. So I'm afraid only labourers should be enjoying what would be called a full English breakfast. So being posh does have its drawbacks, I'm afraid. Now, before the Reformation of the Church, the Catholic Church required that everyone, barring those with a doctor's note saying otherwise, must eat fish, not meat, on Wednesdays and Fridays. But Henry VIII went a step further and ruled that all Englishmen must eat fish on Saturdays as well. This was because the fishermen of the port of Grimsby didn't know what else to do with all the herring they caught. However, as Dr. Bald notes, fish and flesh must never be eaten at the same meal, however much we may be tempted. So definitely no surf and turf. Now, what are vegetables and fruit? Well, the good doctor advises that Englishmen should eat turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions, leeks, garlic, and radishes. Red apples are very good, but he writes, beware of green salad and raw fruits, for they will make you sick. And as for drink, Dr. Bald reminded that some drinks are more suitable for the English than others. He says, ale for an Englishman is a natural drink, but beer is made of malt and water with hops. It is a natural drink for a Dutchman, and now of late days is much used in England to the detriment of many Englishmen, for it doth make a man fat and inflate the belly, as doth appear by Dutchmen's faces and bellies. So with great apologies to any Dutch people among you. So note that the difference between ale and beer was simply that beer was ale with hops added. And this was the Dutch idea, which come to England quite recently. Hops act as a preservative, so the ale keeps longer, and suddenly brewing beer could be done on an industrial scale. But Dr. Bald and many others disapproved of beer. In fact, a number of brewers were prosecuted for adding that filthy weed hops to their ale early in the Tudor period. Now, keeping healthy in Tudor times wasn't just about diet. Remember that holistic approach. Getting the right amount of sleep under the right conditions was also important. Dr. Bald advised a healthy man should never sleep during the day. At night, there must be a fire in the bedchamber to purify the air and consume evil vapors, and the windows must be kept closed. 7 hours sleep is enough for a man, but he must sleep on his right side with his head high, have a good thick quilt, and let his nightcap be of scarlet. He also says that you should frequent merry company, rise in the morning with mirth, and remember God. So there you have the basics for keeping healthy in Tudor England. Oh, and Dr. Bald also said swearing must not be allowed in the house, as it's bad for everyone's health. Now, as the Tudor period continued, there was more and more choice of some new American imports, though probably only for the wealthy, including turkeys, avocados, aubergines or eggplants, as you call them, sweet and ordinary potatoes, tomatoes, and sweet corn. However, most of these foods took ages to catch on. Queen Elizabeth is said to have tried to water Raleigh's newly imported potatoes, but she wasn't impressed, and they didn't become popular for another 2 centuries, and then only as food for the poor. Sweet corn or corn on the cob or maize or whatever you call it was only used as chicken feed well into the 20th century. But one American dish that became popular straight away, at least with those who could afford it, was turkey. It's quite possible that Henry VIII may have enjoyed roast turkey for his Christmas dinner, as the first birds were recorded in England during his reign. The story goes that the first turkeys were brought to England by a Yorkshireman, William Strickland, in 1526. He managed to get hold of a few birds from Native American traders on his travels and sold them for 2 pennies each in Bristol, where his ship docked on the homeward voyage. But this was a one-off event. The Spaniards imported far more turkeys than English merchants did, and most birds sold in England in the 16th century came via Spain. And because this put English silver in Spanish coffers, at the time of the Spanish Armada in 1588, when Spain and England were bitter enemies, Elizabeth I passed a law making the eating of turkey illegal. And as she says, goose is a proper Christmas dish for an Englishman, not turkey. And I haven't been able to find whether that law has ever been rescinded. So for all I know, eating turkey may still be illegal in this country. Now, whatever was being eaten, manners were important at the Tudor dining table. One of the most iconic movies which brought the Tudor period alive on screen was The Private Life of Henry VIII, made in this country in 1933, directed by Alexander Korda and starring Charles Laughton as King Henry. It focused on Henry's later marriage, and the films were a sensational success. So clearly the public loved this tale of Tudor affairs. But you have to beware the so-called authentic royal private life as shown in the film. As a social historian, I'm horrified by scenes like this of King Henry dining at the high table. We see a well-educated Renaissance prince ripping apart his roast chicken, gnawing the meat off the bones and flinging the remains over his shoulder into a bystander's face, and even getting up and standing on the table. Enticing wenches flaunt themselves as they serve plates piled high with food, almost throwing them in front of the diners. Yet this image of Tudor dining is as far from the truth as another of the imaginative scenes in the film when Anne of Cleves wins her freedom from Henry in a game of cards. So what is wrong with this scene of dining? Well, it's true that Tudors did not use forks, although there were pronged tools in the kitchen for lifting meat or fish from boiling pots. And Queen Elizabeth used dainty two-pronged forks to eat sticky sweetmeats at the banquet which would follow the feast. Tudor banqueting halls or follies or pavilions were for the very important guests to retire to, while the servants cleared the trestle tables in the great hall, ready for the entertainments. Meanwhile, the VIPs sipped sweet wine, ate candied fruits, little cakes, Turkish delight, and all kinds of syrupy sweetmeats. This is the banquet, something quite separate from a feast. Now, otherwise, everyone used fingers, which must be washed, nails cleaned, and the instruction books forbid nose picking and farting. Manners were everything to the well-brought-up Tudors. But let's return to chicken-gnawing Henry. Before serving, meat or fish was removed from the bone by trained carvers. If a carver didn't remove every bone and a diner found one on his trencher, this was the most appalling insult. Can you imagine taking offence at a T-bone steak or a chicken drumstick? Well, King Henry would have been aghast seeing a whole chicken set before him, and the carver responsible would probably end up in the Tower of London, awaiting a degree of deboning himself. Bones were disposed of discreetly, often fed to dogs under the table, but they were also a saleable commodity for making glue. They would never have been thrown around. And as for buxom serving wenches, they belonged in disreputable taverns. At court or in a gentleman's household, all servers at dinner were male. So Tudor feasts are a decorous affair with dainty dishes, elegant presentation, and sober waiters. At least that's true until the serving of the subtlety, the last dish of each course. Wondrous contraptions of sugarwork and marzipan, rather like wedding cakes without the cake, were called subtleties, and these were the pinnacles of the confectioner's art. Castles, dragons spitting flame, warships firing cannon, mythical figures, and trick boxes, the more elaborate the better, were paraded and admired by the diners before the folk on the lower tables were let loose to smash the masterpiece, grab the best bits, and eat them. It was a free-for-all, courtesy forgotten, at least until the trumpet announced the service of the next course, when everyone returned to their places at table to begin fine dining once more. So don't believe history as you see it in the movies. They don't let the truth ruin a good show. Now, whether you're planning on traveling back 500 years or prefer to enjoy the Tudor adventure from the safety of your sofa, if you want to know about fashion, literature, leisure activities, money, religion, spying, and numerous other topics, my book, How to Survive in Tudor England, is the handy guide which could save your life or simply help you get the best from your time-traveling exploration. And if you fancy traveling back into other periods in English history, There is also How to Survive in Medieval England and How to Survive in Anglo-Saxon England, both available in this series. So, are there any questions?
Yeah. Okay, so I opened up the chat for everybody. You can chat with each other, but if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen. I have to say, Toni, that it's really difficult to hear about how, the travelers coming over to North America just completely disregarded Native Americans in
They
this whole
did.
thing. Yeah,
They didn't prepare themselves either. They actually came over with gold mining equipment. So
mm,
they thought they were just going to dig the ground, get rich. They didn't bring farming equipment. In fact, they were all gentlemen. They knew nothing about farming. So,
crazy. Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
just with
so,
the way that you described, like they were just like, you know, there are people here, but they don't count. It's just hard to hear, knowing
yes.
like what we know now. So, okay, we do have some questions.
Okay.
And that was the start of this first question is, did somebody sponsor Drake's trip around the world?
Sorry.
Did someone sponsor Drake's trip around the world?
Um, yes. Various noblemen sponsored him. And he did a lot of piracy on shorter trips. He came back to England and gave, it said, half the booty, though I think it's probably less than half, to Queen Elizabeth I.
Mhm.
And she was so pleased with it that, yes, she did sponsor a little bit of his next tour, but actually he had enough money from the first piracy trips, yes, to pay for it.
Mhm.
But other noblemen climbed on the bandwagon and contributed because they hoped that they would get, piles of gold and silver and spices and other exotic goods when
Mhm.
he got back.
Okay.
Yes.
But Isabella really sponsored a lot of Spaniards to come to the New World. Is that correct?
Yes, Isabella of Spain. Yes, I mean, she sponsored Columbus.
That's right. That's right. Okay.
So England wouldn't have seen any of that.
hmm
But yes, Spain got rich. In fact, much of the problem of inflation throughout Europe in the Tudor period was down to Spain flooding the markets with American silver. So silver ended up not being worth much.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so somebody asked, were there poorhouses in Tudor England?
Not to begin with. Later on, they started to require each parish to set up a poorhouse.
hmm
King Edward VI actually gave his palace. He had so many palaces from his father that he actually gave a palace as a poorhouse in London. But it was all about making people work.
hmm
And the jobs they had to do was things like stuffing feather beds
hmm
that nobody wanted to do, or unraveling rope, which then used to caulk ships, make them waterproof. Nobody wanted to do that because it tore your fingers to pieces. They were all horrible jobs.
hmm
Uh,
Well, unfortunately, they probably think as long if they're starving, they'll do it. That's unfortunate.
yes,
What were the punishments for stealing food?
hanging
Hanging. Yeah.
mostly. Yeah, a first offence, you would often be branded.
Oh.
They'll brand your thumb for a minor offence, or sometimes they would brand your forehead with a T for thief. They also branded women with a P for prostitute if they were caught doing that. So you were quite literally labelled for the rest of your life. But a second offence, probably hanging. As there's the phrase, you might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb, which suggests, don't take one egg, take a dozen, because if you're caught, the punishment's the same.
Roger asks, how often did folks really empty toilets into the street? We talked about this last time too.
Right, well, you tip the chamber pot out of the window every morning. There's actually a Tudor woodcut, which literally shows a woman pulls her skirts up and defecating in the street. Mm-hmm. So, hygiene was non-existent, really. And in fact, the Tudors were a lot less keen on bathing than the medieval people were. People like Dr. Board start saying bathing is bad for you. It opens the pores and lets all the evil miasmas rush in. So don't bathe because it's so bad.
Yeah. So can you just, the Tudor period was from when to when? It did include the Elizabethan period.
Well, Tudors come to the throne 1485. Queen Elizabeth first dies in 1603. She's the last Tudor. So it's 100, not even 120 years.
Oh, wow.
Now, the Renaissance in Europe starts in the 1300s in Italy and gradually spreads out across Europe. But England is in the Renaissance by the 1440s, 1450s.
So you had said that Henry VII left quite a bit of money to Henry VIII. So why did inflation happen so dramatically for Henry VIII?
Because Henry VIII spent the lot. Henry VII dies in 1509. Henry VIII becomes king by 1520, so it's just 11 years. He's got no money left. Wow. He spent it on building up the navy and doing this and doing that. So one reason for closing down all the monasteries, it wasn't just religious, it was to get the money because the church was so wealthy. Henry needed that money to refill the coffers, but that makes him a Protestant monarch faced by all the Catholic monarchs of Europe, the King of France, the King of Spain, the King of Portugal, all of those. And he suddenly realizes he's now in danger. The Pope gives all those monarchs permission, if you like, to come and kill Henry, take England, bring her back to the Catholic faith. So now he needs all that money he got from closing the monasteries to build forts all around southern England, to build up a navy and to arm an army if he's invaded. So once again, all the money disappears. So he keeps devaluing the coins. The coinage that Queen Elizabeth inherits is so degraded. It's got so many impurities in the silver that foreign merchants won't accept it. Yes, and a man called Thomas Gresham actually reinvents England's finances. That's in the book.
Oh, okay. So we have a bunch of questions left in about 5 more minutes. I'm trying to get to as many as possible. So when these monasteries were destroyed, did any of them get restored?
A few of them, the main church was kept intact if it was used as a parish church by the locals. So
Mhm.
we do have some very grand local parish churches in one or two places,
Mhm.
because it was often a grand abbey at one point, in which case in St Albans Abbey
Mhm.
was also used by the locals. A little part of it's a parish church, so they were allowed to keep that. So
Mhm.
one or two abbeys, yes, survived, but the majority that were not close to a village or not used as a parish church just went.
Yeah. Oh, too bad. Two people want to know what was entertainment like in Tudor times.
Well, Mina and I were talking earlier that the first novel was actually written in the reign of Edward VI.
Hmm.
So that's around 1544, 45. But when Edward VI dies, his sister Mary becomes queen and makes everything Catholic again. And unfortunately, the first novel had a very anti-Catholic slant to it. But it's called Beware the Cat. Yes. And if you look at the front cover of my book, there's a funny looking animal at the top of the page. That's the woodcut of the cat from that novel. And the idea is that cats listen to everything that's said in the house.
Hmm.
So they're like spies.
Hmm.
And cats communicate with each other and tell these stories and can get you into trouble.
Hmm.
But the book wasn't actually published until after Mary Tudor was gone and Elizabeth changed the religion back to Protestantism. So the book's published about 1558, but
Hmm.
was actually written a decade or more before that. It's quite a good read. It's tricky because it's not like what we would read, but it's a good story.
Hmm. Um, I want to ask this question about since the poor were dying in such vast numbers, how were their bodies dealt with? Were they just dying in secluded areas, not noticed? I mean, I always think of that movie, there was a like one Monty Python movie where they're just piling them into carts. How was that dealt with?
Well, yes, in times of plague, and there was also another disease in the early Tudor period called the sweating sickness, which seems to have been some sort of influenza, which was really, it could kill you in a few hours. Um, yeah, not unlike COVID in its symptoms, you got respiratory problems.
Mhm.
Um, yes, whenever disease like that was rampant, there could be hasty mass burials. And a lot of those have been archaeologically examined in this country. But for the most part, people did get a proper burial.
Oh,
Uh,
good.
yeah, the difficulty would be for some people that having been raised a Catholic, you might get a Protestant burial,
Mm.
or having been raised a Protestant, if you died in Mary's reign, you might get a Catholic burial. So the two didn't always marry up. But yeah, a proper Christian burial was seen as just about everybody's right.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
they did respect the dead, even if they didn't respect the living.
Wow. So Barbara says, last comment, that Amazon has the Beware of Cats books for $500. So got a little extra cash? Go for it.
Oh, well, the text is available online for free.
Oh, all right.
Um,
Go.
so, yeah, yeah,
Well, thank you, Toni. Thank you so
yeah,
much for this.
it's on an academic website, but just Google Beware the Cat. There is an academic website with the complete text.
Okay. Well, we'll look
It's
for it because
quite long.
first novel, looking for it. Okay. So, Toni, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate you coming back again to talk about Tudor England. And like I said, Toni will be back with us in May for How to Survive Anglo-Saxon England, which is interesting to me that all the different eras have different way needs to different things happening that you have to survive them. So I appreciate all of this wonderful commentary from everybody who's been here and the questions. I know we didn't get to them all, but I appreciate all of your thoughts about the concept. You can get the book again. You can buy it from Aesop's Fable, contact Toni, or find it from your local library. Thank you, Toni. This has been awesome.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's been lovely seeing you again.
Oh, you too.
Thank you very much.
All right, everybody, have a wonderful rest of your Saturday. Happy reading.